Let's talk about reading Emily Dickinson's poetry. Emily Dickinson is hands down my favorite poet, and she's a great choice for book clubs because she's such an important figure in American literature. Once you've read some of her poetry, you'll start to find references to her work everywhere. Dickinson was born in 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts, and she died in 1888. In that short life of just a little over 50 years, she wrote more than 1,800 poems, and only a few of them, maybe a dozen, were published during her lifetime. In fact, a lot of her family and friends had no idea how much poetry Emily Dickinson had written during her life. She had carefully copied over about 1,100 of those poems into little hand-sewn booklets called fascicles, which her sister Lavinia discovered after Emily Dickinson died. There's a long story then about how those poems finally came to publication. Lavinia brought these poems to a woman named Mabel Loomis Todd, who was married to an Amherst College professor. And Todd brought in a co-editor, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and together they published 3 volumes of Dickinson's poetry between 1890 and 1896. But the problem is they regularized all of her punctuation. They changed a lot of her words to make them clearer. In fact, they took away the Dickinsonian character of her poetry. So those first 3 volumes really weren't the best representation of the poetry that Dickinson actually wrote. Later on, Dickinson's niece and Mabel Loomis Todd's daughter both separately edited more volumes of Dickinson's poetry, but it wasn't until the 1950s that an editor named Thomas Johnson finally put together a complete collection of Dickinson's poetry that honored the original versions of the poems as she had written them. So when you look for a collection to read with your book club, be sure to either read Johnson's version or one of the collections edited by R.W. Franklin, or one of the newer collections that has also come out in the past 10 or 20 years. Emily Dickinson has a somewhat unfair reputation as being a recluse, a kind of odd woman who always wore white and hid away in her house. It's not really true. She was a homebody, but many women of her time mostly spent their time at home. She was an avid gardener, and of course she spent a lot of her time alone in her room writing poetry. Also, she has a reputation for having a preoccupation with death. And while it's true that a lot of her poems are about death, she also explores lots of other subjects, including art and nature and spirituality. So keep your mind open to who Dickinson really was, and don't let those strange rumors about her color your understanding of her poetry. So what do I love about Emily Dickinson as a poet? She's absolutely fearless. She's a complete original. She does things her own way. Her punctuation, her metaphors, her diction, her choice of words, everything is really unusual about her poetry. I also love that she's a woman writing poetry at a time when no one was seriously encouraging women to do such a thing. And that may have something to do with why her poems turn out to be so unique. At the same time, she's completely humble. She doesn't seem to have any sense of herself as a great poet. She's simply writing the poetry that's meaningful to her. So I'd like to leave you with a few tips on how to read Emily Dickinson with your book club. I would recommend that you choose only 6, 7, or maybe 8 poems to work on together. Every poem is short, but they're so rich and there's so much to do with them. If you visit the website for Emily Dickinson's Homestead, they actually have a tab where they suggest 12 of her poems that are good for beginners. I'll leave the link for that below for you. There are also some tips on that website for how to read her poetry, but I'll leave you with 3 that I think are the most important. The first one is to assume that she has something to tell us today. Expect that her poetry is still relevant, and think about how it connects to our own experience. Second of all, assume that there's not just one right way to read them. As with any great literature, assume that what you bring to your reading of that poem is relevant and important. And do your best to understand where she's coming from, but at the same time, don't be afraid to put forward your own ideas, your own interpretations, your own understanding of the poem when you talk about it with your book club. Don't feel that there's only one correct answer. That's the kind of thing that's going to hold everybody back from contributing. You might also want to have a Bible and a dictionary handy while you're reading Dickinson, or have your phone out and be ready to do some online searches, because she is going to make allusions to things that you might not be familiar with. I always find it helpful to read through the whole poem or the whole piece first, and just mark the things that I want to go back and look up later. Reading poetry can be intimidating to a lot of people. I have another video on general tips for reading poetry with your book club, but the number one thing is just to jump in and try it. Don't be embarrassed about not knowing exactly how to read it or how to talk about it in the beginning. Emily Dickinson is a great place for you and your book club to start. I hope you'll give her a try. Read on!